Hello, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Internet Archive and Library Futures, I want to welcome you to today's event. It's called Why Trust a Corporation to Do a Library's Job, featuring author Joanne McNeil and artist technologist Darius Kazemi. I'm Wendy Hanamura. I'm the Director of Partnerships here at the Internet Archive. You can see the great room behind me in San Francisco. For those of you who might not know us, the Internet Archive is one of the world's largest digital libraries. We're best known for our feature, The Wayback Machine, with its 50 billion web pages archived, but we also have amazing collections of music and games and films, and 4.6 million digital books. And as a library, we love books. And I want to say, I love this book in particular, Lurking: How a Person Became a User. I want to ask you, do you have your copy of this book yet? It's just out in paperback. It's so affordable. And if you want to buy this book, I'm urging you to go to our local bookstore, the Booksmith. They have a tremendously good online store. And the first 50 people who buy the book from the Booksmith will get an autographed copy by Joanne. And we're going to invite you to stay afterwards to have a chat with the author, just like if we were here in person. Meanwhile, we would also like you to participate throughout the event. I love it that you're putting in the chat where you're coming from, but if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in chat and we will feed them and weave them in throughout this next hour. Also, if you are a social media maven and you want to tweet about this, here are the handles of our participants. We'll drop those in chat too, so you'll have them ready for you. Please tell your communities about what you're learning, the questions you have, and the event today. Well, let's get started. I just wanted to start by reminding us all that in just 6 days, on May 4th, Yahoo Answers is going to go dark. There will be no more questions. There will be no more answers, except if you can find them somehow in an archive like the Wayback Machine. And yet, even though this happens time and again, we continue to believe that Yahoo and Google and Facebook and all of the platforms will take care of our comments and our blogs and our images and all of the kind of creative output we pour onto them. When we do this at what cost? Those are some of the questions that we're going to be getting to in today's event. Why trust a corporation to do a library's job? It's my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. First, Joanne McNeil, who is, as you know, a writer. She often grapples with kind of the social creative application on the internet and what that means for people. Perhaps you saw her Guardian piece last week on Yahoo Answers. And of course, we hope you will have read her very first book, Lurking: How a Person Became a User. Joanne has said that the internet is imperfect, but it offers us so much. Joining her is her good friend and colleague, Darius Kazemi. Now, Darius is a little hard to pigeonhole. He's a coder, he manages small online communities, and he's an internet artist. What does that mean? Well, it means that he has created this whole army of bots that go out and feed you things. And I was really delighted to find out that among Darius's bots is a bot that will feed you short clips of Prelinger films from the Internet Archive and beautiful images from Smithsonian books in the Internet Archive. Please follow him on all his fora at Tiny Subversions. So I want to welcome Joanne and Darius. Thank you for joining us.
At Tiny Subversions.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I am really happy to be here with the two of you as well. Joanne, I wanted to start kind of at the beginning, when you were growing up in this early internet culture of the 90s, and kind of taking your first forays into places like, I don't know, chat rooms on AOL. How did that impact your future career?
Oh, absolutely. Just to give the brief story of how a user became a writer. I was not someone who grew up thinking I could ever be a writer. That just wasn't an identity available to me as far as I knew. But when I logged on to the internet when I was a teenager, I was enjoying that process of crafting sentences, enjoying uh, collecting my thoughts and putting them not on a page but on a screen. And meanwhile, I was hearing from my internet friends, that email you sent was really that was written very well. And over the years from there, I went on to writing on a blog, and my writing was visible on the web. Editors reached out to me, and to have people see potential in me when I didn't was quite enormous, as well as the opportunities that were presented to me because my work was visible. Now, a lot of luck went into it as well, but I do not doubt that to this day, there are teenagers writing on something like Reddit and having their friends say, "Hey, you're a pretty good writer." And mind you, AOL is not exactly like the internet at its best. So yes, they're probably using some less than ideal tools, but it's the users might be offering something, they might be getting something from that process of writing.
Well, how about you, Darius? You in the 90s, did this new thing called the internet create the path, the creative path for you?
I mean, I spent my early teen years making GeoCities websites and stuff like that. And it certainly led me, I think I've considered myself kind of someone who lives on the internet since a very young age. My art practice happens on the internet because that's where I spend my entire daily life, basically. I work for companies that make websites. My friends are all online. I mean, especially in the last year, but so it just makes sense for me to want to do art where I live. And so that's been my motivation.
So you both live and work on the internet. The internet created your creative path as a writer, as an artist, and yet the book is called Lurking. And you warn us, Joanne, that we use the internet at our own risk. How so?
Right. I mean, the experiences that a user has on the internet can be quite profound, can be creative and very human. But the intermediaries to participate with a lot of the social media and websites, and especially nowadays, you are dealing with corporations and you don't have the elements of control. So with my book, I what is unique about it is I'm coming there with a sense of knowing that my career that I came up through the internet, and I have seen the internet at its best. I know what can happen even when you're using imperfect tools. But at the same time, what is the trade-off? What are they taking from you? How are you being tricked to be part of it? All of these elements. And meanwhile, the subject of this discussion, how can we rein some of that power back? How can we, I don't think it's impossible.
That is the question that I want us to all in the audience and here on the panel keep in our minds. How do we get that power back, the power that we have ceded to these platforms? I want to go back though, Joanne, and ask you, you've been a writer for many years, very successful, but how did you decide to write this book? What was the thing that inspired it?
Well, it was just as personal as could be, because I was dealing with that tension between the freedom of writing on the internet and the difficulty of writing for institutions like legacy media. My editor of Lurking reached out to me 12 years ago. I didn't publish a book back then because publishing is still extremely hard to break into. So that tension is something that I have lived through. I've seen how reluctant publications were to tackle questions of the internet outside of stories of IPOs and valuations. Like when I look back, when I first started, there was a lot of resistance to the pieces that I was pitching. I had a lot of pieces killed. And I always thought it was just, maybe I don't know the ropes. I'm not a real writer. But when I look back at my archives, I'd see, the responses were things like, this is a product review. But nowadays it makes sense. I was writing from a user's perspective, but because the story of technology was so focused on the founders, it was focused on the business and the money, which is not not to say we don't need to focus on these things, because that's definitely part of the story, but we are there too. The users, the individuals who do not have the power, the culture, the society, the friendships, the communities, the humanity. And those were the stories that nowadays there is an internet culture beat, but 10 years ago, those stories were very hard to find.
Yeah, so we're waking up to the fact that somehow in this paradigm of the internet, we stopped being people and we started being users, and with all the attendant problems of that. Now, Darius, you revealed to me that you are the son of a librarian. And that,
I'm not the son of a librarian. I'm the son of someone with a lot of librarian friends.
So you come from a library extended family.
Certainly spent a lot of time in libraries as a kid.
We all did, right? I think. But I wonder if today's generation does, because when I was growing up, if you had a research question, you could go to your local branch and you would ask the reference librarian to help you. And she would go back in the stacks and she would get you answers. I don't know if that was true when you were growing up in a later age. But now, when a young person, an old person, anyone has a question, they just go to their browser and they write it in, and Google hopefully will get them the answer. Search is the new librarian. What is Google the internet's library?
I think Joanne really hits the nail on the head with this in her book, where she talks about how Google is like, when you first started using search engines, it was very much like writing code almost. You had to put a string in like this and that, or this, not that, when you were using Alta Vista or something, and how Google changed it so that you could ask natural language questions. And I think they're very consciously trying to replace that, but I don't think it's the same. It's I remember going to librarians with my questions, and they would not only help me find the answer, but also sort of teach me how they did it, and kind of teach me to find it myself in the future, or learn about these other resources that are out there, and also suggest other options for me to look at.
Yeah, one thing I could add to that is with Google, from the early days, it felt private because you were alone. So I want to contrast that with when you walk into a library, there is no, I quote Jessamine West in my book, who says there are no libraries without librarians. So that early experience of dealing with Google, you're entering into search string, all of us have probably experienced being worried about a health situation or something, typing something into Google, incredibly private. It feels private because you are alone with the information. So, but meanwhile, it is a corporation that is accumulating it and perhaps discarding it, perhaps using it for something that doesn't really make sense. Like, a handful of search strings don't matter much, but can it be a corpus for machine learning experiments? Like there are uses like Google can now kind of spin off, but that sense of that's part of the tension here. Is I realized when I was writing that chapter in particular about a feeling of like being relaxed, because I didn't expect someone was looking over my shoulder, but I was still giving something to a corporation without having really thought through what that means and how it could grow and what is taken from me. In contrast with a library where you are not alone when you look for information. You can have someone there who can help guide you in your search, and that social community connection is not possible with Google, and consequently, Google is not accountable when it discards its corpus. It's not accountable to people.
Yeah, the accountability piece is so different there. If you come to your librarian with something, that might be private or semi-private or whatever, and you want to keep it between you and the librarian, you could have that conversation with the librarian. And if they breach that trust, you know who to go to and complain and, see about them getting, some kind of consequence for that breach of trust. Whereas for Google, they don't even really promise that at all to begin with. But even if they did breach something, it's like, well, okay, do I live in the EU? Do I have to take this to court over GDPR or something? It's very, it's a totally different accountability chain.
Exactly. Working for a library, I've come to understand that reader privacy is one of the greatest values, the highest and most defended values in librarianship. So at the Internet Archive, if you check out a book, we scramble the IP every day so that we couldn't even tell the FBI what Darius was reading if they asked us.
Thank God.
Yeah, thank goodness, right? But that's how serious a library takes your privacy. Whereas, these corporations, the questions you ask are what you're paying them, right? They're taking that data and understanding your patterns. And I was talking to Tristan Harris, the founder of Center for Humane Technology, and he said, Wendy, everyone thinks that they're listening to you or they're spying on you in Facebook. It's really just that they're following your keystrokes, and it's very predictive. If you look at this and this and this, that next you're going to want to look at that. So that's kind of what we're giving: convenience and ease for becoming the data that drives the company. I want to ask you to perhaps become dystopian for us and think what this means 20 years out. If we keep going in this direction, what do you see happening?
Well, I think just what immediately comes to mind is what I'm seeing right now, which frightens me a little bit, is that the sense of these companies being fragile because of their youth is going away, because in 20 years, someone who is 40 years old will have not known a life before Google. And that's the history that they forced into the culture in the absence of the media coverage that we needed 10 years ago. They've been able to rewrite their histories and make it seem as though they've just always been there, make it seem like they have taken over the role that library as an institution have taken on without offering the community function. This frightens me a great deal, and that's why I am very, obviously I wrote a book that deals with internet history, so of course this is my agenda, but I am an accidental historian. It's more that I lived through this history and I could see these companies rewriting their histories. So if we see this power to them, not just the power of the scale, which they have accumulated from our work, from our humanity, from the search strings, from the posts and things we put up on YouTube, but also allow to rewrite this history that people forget what a library was and has been and can continue to be, as opposed to Google. That's what I feel like we need to broaden this conversation. That's what I like, and that's why I'm very happy to be here and address this topic specifically.
Darius, where do you see this all headed?
I mean, I'm really bad at thinking dystopically because I just look around and I go, it's bad enough already. I don't need to imagine worse than this at the moment. So I just tend to put on my hat and try to build things out so that next week is a little bit better than this week, hopefully. So I'm going to kind of avoid that question. I think it's just bad enough right now.
Fair enough. And we all, I promise you, audience, going to get to solutions and brighter topics. But I do want to start with the first chapter of your book, which was about search. And you do kind of a case study of Google and how Google cozied up to libraries. Joanne, can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yes, in fact, this was the chapter that I had to kind of make a case for, even to myself, because this is a book of users and it would be very easy to focus on social media. And Google is not, we don't really think of Google as social media, but I knew instinctively that process that you're where you're connecting to this alienated information that if when you enter that search string and you end up at like an old Yahoo Answers page, you won't in a couple months when that's taken down, and that's another thing. But when you come across a blog post from 2006, when you come across some YouTube material, this is humans engaging with each other, but just completely abstracted. So I wanted to identify how unique that is, and contrast that with the library, because Google has, like many other big companies, Goodreads. My friend Tim Mon, who's an author, just tweeted about how Goodreads says on their website, they are like a library, so you can't take books down, you can't remove your book from their database. So it's like a lot, and Amazon has done this too. A lot of the big tech companies have portrayed themselves as like libraries just because they deal with data. And Google, in my book, I discuss a piece that Jessamine West wrote. She is a librarian, and she talks about Google showing up at ALA conference and courting librarians, like talking to them back in 2005. People still not sure what Google is necessarily, but they're putting themselves in this context and community. And they had a newsletter about libraries. They were just kind of, oh, hey, we're just like a library. You understand information. It's what you do here, and we're the same, and we want to be your friends. But several years later, they returned to ALA and portray themselves as first-time vendors after they've closed the newsletter, they've shut a few things down, and just I found if someone could link to Jessamine's piece. It's on her Medium page. I can link to it on Twitter later, but I would absolutely recommend reading it, because it is so instructive as to how they do not have any institutional memory is not a concern of Google. So that is a stark difference between the library community and Google.
So if I hear you correctly, during the era of Google Books, when Google needed libraries because they were going to embark on the most ambitious book digitization project ever mounted, I think. By some accounts, they have now digitized some 250 million books. But they needed libraries because that's where the books lived, Michigan and Harvard and other places. And during that period, they portrayed themselves as a library. But when Google Books wound down, that institutional memory, that persona of Google as librarian was also dropped.
Google Books was one element, but the other key is Google expressing its mission. I mean, it's actually there were multiple reasons why they were kind of entering into the space and talking about themselves as a library, but it was how they communicated what they were as a tech company. As you know, people would understand search and what a search engine is, but all of a sudden they were not just the search engine, but they were assuming the responsibility of providing this information and organizing it, which no corporation should do. And meanwhile, by assuming that role, it means that information off Google, if Google is the world's provider of information, if it organizes information, if it makes it available and accessible, what does it mean if something is not on Google? What does it mean if information is wrong on Google? Like information, names on a map. I give an example of a neighborhood that has been renamed because on Google Maps, they spelled it wrong. And it's just like the neighborhood now has changed, the name of the neighborhood has changed just because of people looking at Google Maps over the years. That's the power this company has.
Darius, do you have thoughts on the omnipotent power of Google and what that means?
I mean, this is where I get into my thing, which is thinking about these futures and ways out. So, I think about Google, needing to, like the fact that Google needed to borrow from libraries or steal basically this identity from libraries in order to make themselves legible to other people, I think that points to the fact that there is power in libraries as an institution. They wouldn't take something if it didn't give them something, right? If there wasn't something there for them. So for me, I like to flip it on its head and think about, well, what if libraries, free public libraries, are the Google and the information providers for their community, right? Like, what if we imagine that and take it to a place where we can think about what other sorts of services a library might provide. And of course, I understand that libraries are underfunded and stuff, but let's imagine what they could be. So I think about, I have a kind of a manifesto that I wrote called Run Your Own Social, and I maintain small online communities, and I try to encourage other people to maintain their own small online communities as well, with specifically where you own the computer that runs the community, or the community owns it. It's not just hosted on Reddit or Facebook or something like that. And specifically, I like to think about how this could scale, right? Because not everybody knows. That's the advantage to a big company, right? Is that they can just scale this stuff up, kind of to global levels. But with that comes these massive trade-offs. So I like to think about scale, and this is, of course, in an American context. I live in America, so I think about American free public libraries. But I like to think about a thought experiment where, well, what if your library maintained small local online communities for the community that you belong to? Because not everybody knows someone like me, who's a programmer, who can maintain a chat server and maintain a forum and all that kind of stuff. But everybody in America at least knows, to some extent, a librarian, or at least they know where they can go to find a librarian. And so I imagine, like, Multnomah County, where I live, maybe they would host a social network for anyone with a Multnomah County library card, right? And then if something goes wrong on there and you need moderation and that sort of thing, you're not going to Facebook, and you're not going to try and get the attention of, like, Mark Zuckerberg. You are instead knocking on the door of your library and you're saying, hey, I'm being harassed. What can you do about this? Or, hey, I think this person is, inciting violence or whatever, right? And we need to have a conversation about that. And I also like that because Facebook can't understand the norms of what passes for civic discourse in every location on the planet. It's literally impossible. And so I like the idea, like, libraries already spend time thinking about what the norms of their communities are when they have to think about acquisitions, and when they have to think about policies. So I really think it could be a natural place to have, like, I would personally love to be the person who works at a library and runs the social network for Multnomah County, right? For example, that would be a dream job. So anyway, that's the thought experiment that I take it to, is like, well, why, if Google can take this power from libraries, why can't libraries provide services that Google literally can't, because they're at scale too much?
So what you're describing, if I hear you correctly, Darius, is content moderation in social media at the local level, with someone you can talk to who has a face and a name, and somebody who has the values and the skills of a librarian to control the flow of this information, to take it down when called upon.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And when I run my small online community, it's just all people who trust each other, and we share a set of values. And when something difficult comes up, we talk about it, and people come straight to me, and they trust me. And and I turn people away from the small online community who I don't know, or who don't trust me, or whatever. And similarly, a resident of the county where I live there's some level of trust in your local government institutions that I think that scales quite nicely.
What I think is sure. What I think is really powerful about what Darius is describing here is that he's showing what is possible today with our internet, as imperfect as it is right now. We can do this on a community level. And I think having, for users and communities, to be exposed to independent social media, to be exposed to alternatives to Facebook or Instagram, is already incredibly powerful. I mean, I think something that I really tried to make clear in my book is that, yes, there were corporations back then. I was on AOL, and there was also Usenet, and there were more alternatives that were independent, but it was still not perfect. And I don't think we're never going to get that perfect internet. So if we can still make use of tools, the independence of the World Wide Web, independence of something like what Darius is proposing with Run Your Own Social, it is not easy, but it's available and it can be done.
Well, one of the things that it strikes me makes Google so powerful is its sheer scale. And as you said, people have come to believe that if they Google it and it's not there, it doesn't exist. It's one of the major problems that the Internet Archive is trying to fight, really, that there is a lot of knowledge that is not online. There's a whole century of books that have never made it to the digital world. There is, magnetic media, and you've seen our 78 collection that we're trying to grow. Lots of things have never transferred into this new digital era of ours. So how do we provide scale of knowledge through libraries? What are there other solutions, and who's out there trying to solve these bigger issues?
I guess not to move too far away from the question, but I think because the word scale is so wrapped up with those big tech giants, that maybe that's not the word we're looking for. It's more that the space and room and the space to thrive, which would be a community function, and all of these communities working at the same time, serving their communities, could amount to something that challenges what Google is. And I would say libraries now are already doing that. The fact that we have libraries is showing that the impossible is possible. And the fact that these spaces exist where no one is asking you for money to be inside that space. You do not have to pay anything. That experience, which is, I think, I don't think you'll meet a writer or an artist who hasn't had a profound experience as a youth going to a library and being overwhelmed by the kind of the community function. And that, so when we think about it, we are working locally and serving communities, but if so long as that's there in every community, it is already providing alternative.
I'm seeing in chat that they're asking us, why is there not a librarian in this conversation? Good point. And we have a librarian who is about to join us. So I think I'll bring in Jenny Rose Halpern. Jenny is the executive director of a brand new organization called Library Futures. It is out there fighting for the rights, the digital rights of libraries. And that may seem strange, right? Because don't libraries have the rights that they have always had? But in truth, folks, we are at a pivotal moment. Books have always had, libraries have always had the right to buy books and lend books to people for free. But now as we transition to ebooks, the publishers are not allowing libraries to buy those, but only to subscribe to them, to license them for limited periods and a certain number of lends. So you can imagine, fast forward 20 years, what that's going to mean when we are more and more creatures of the ebook. So Jenny, tell us about Library Futures. You are a librarian. You represent library coalitions. What is it that you are out there trying to fight?
Thanks so much, Wendy. This has been really fascinating. And so first off, I call myself a bit of a rogue librarian. I've worked in and around libraries since 2006. And I'm so excited to be here with all of you. This has been one of the most fascinating chats I've ever seen in an event. I want to have a virtual potluck with all 270 of you. This has been really, really great. So two words that have been coming up for me as I've been listening to Joanne and Darius and Wendy's talk are the words autonomy and citizenship. And so autonomy, I think, is something that is really, really important in libraries, particularly in public libraries. And so I saw somebody who was commenting like, you know, what does it actually mean on the ground? Like, what does it look like for libraries in digital space? And so some of the stories that we've heard are teachers paying, school librarians paying $27 per student per year for a copy of the Diary of Anne Frank. And we're seeing, you know, libraries have to pay per loan to companies for books that disappear, right? And so I would say that that is fundamentally not how a library works, right? So like you buy something and then you can lend it until it wears out. And this artificial scarcity that's put on digital objects as a way supposedly to create a market for digital books is really hurting the public. I think it's one of the most important consumer protection issues right now. And so one of the things that Joanne and I have talked a lot about in the past has been around publishing and how Library Futures and other library advocacy groups and our coalition is really looking to build an equitable publishing ecosystem. So that means a publishing ecosystem that's equitable for authors, that's equitable for communities, that's equitable for local jurisdictions, and that's equitable for people who use materials. Because what we're seeing really are these super long waiting lines. 40% of students were not prepared to learn digitally. And so you look at this and you say, okay, there is a solution to this. There are technical solutions to this. There are advocacy solutions to this. And that's what Library Futures was set up to help solve. So we've been launched for about 3 months and are so excited to be part of this conversation.
Well, Darius, you're a thoughtful internet observer. When you see this struggle going on as libraries try to define their roles in a digital world, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really want to come back to what Joanne was saying about scale earlier, because I think that we can, independent entities, be they just small communities and people, groups of friends and that sort of thing, or libraries or other local entities, you know, we can offer something that big companies can't. We can offer services that big companies can't. Like when people join the small community that I run, I do a 1 to 2 hour long video call with every new user who's really a person, right? To borrow from Joanne's book. And I can customize the onboarding. You know, if somebody is already fine with the tech stuff, then I just focus on the social implications instead. If someone needs tech help, I give them more tech help. You know, I could imagine a library that maintains an online community but has in-person events where people can come in and say, hey, I'm having trouble using the software. Can you help me out? And a real person can sit down with them and go over and ask them what their needs are, and even incorporate that back into the software itself, perhaps, or the way that the community is moderated, and listen to people that way. And so that is a competitive advantage over something like Google. They literally cannot do that. So that's the kind of thing that I like to think about is what are the things that structurally a large thing working at scale cannot provide, and that's where small communities can compete.
And so just to follow up on that, one thing that I think we see a lot, and somebody had commented about this too, is like libraries as metonym. Like, what can a library actually do? Like, you read these articles, it's like, well, we need to fix the internet. It's 10,000 librarians. And what I think that Darius brings up really well is what libraries actually do and what libraries can do with cooperation. What these, what is the teaching role of a library in a community? What is the role of consortia? What is the role of groups, of advocacy groups, of librarians, of library people, really expanding the notion of what it means to do community, of what it means to do technology. And I think that what you were bringing up of this question of like, what does it mean to actually teach someone to be a citizen together, to be in a community together? I really do think that that is one of the roles, particularly with a high level of cooperation that libraries can really fill on the web and on the internet, particularly by using tools that are created by people rather than sort of this conception of a user. Librarians, there's this sort of ongoing question of are people patrons? Are they users? Are they communities? What are they? And I think that we can really think of people as all of this, and the roles that libraries can play as being this sort of space of education, of I know the word innovation is loaded, but let's just say innovation, the space of real engagement within more than just their individual information seeking needs, but within the information seeking needs of communities.
And it's something, oh, sorry, Joanne, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm so glad Jenny added all of this, and that goes to show why we did need a librarian in our group. But I wanted to add that one thing that those tech companies did when they fetished libraries is they had a disembodied idea of it. So the actual messy reality of libraries as an institution, which are not perfect and do have like white supremacist history and many ways also need to be improved, and it's an ongoing process. But the thing they're not taking away from libraries is what Jenny just expressed, that sense of community, stewardship, people coming together on a local level, because a corporation at that scale, it is impossible to offer that.
Yeah, I that feeds into what I was going to also mention, which is that they look at a corporation will look at a library and say, oh, their mission is to provide information to their community or something, and that's not necessarily the mission of a library. And one of the things that I love when I'm talking on a panel or whatever, and someone asks me like, oh, what's your retention policy for yours? How do you get better retention on your small social community? What's your revenue goal or whatever? And my goal is with all this stuff, and I think should be with all this stuff, is not is really just the happiness of the people who are involved in the community, right? That's it. That's the goal, full stop. So even though a library might not even be able to have, let's imagine that a library only has access to some small piece of information and Google has access to a lot more information. Okay, that doesn't matter because Google's not trying to make you happy, right? Like, a library is here to improve your quality of life, and they're going to do it within the confines of the limitations of the resources that they have, but that's what they're there for.
Mm-hmm. Well, they are trying to make you happy, but on kind of a consumer level. Like, it's make you happy enough to buy more things.
I don't actually believe that leads to happiness personally. So that's like a moral and philosophical issue and difference that I have.
I wanted to ask Joanne, as an author, oftentimes now we're seeing publishers say, well, we have to license these ebooks because it benefits authors. But how do you see this? Because we can imagine a day when library shelves the digital shelves will be empty and a book like yours won't be available because Multnomah County Library is not going to be able to license it again in its 20th year. of after publication. How do you see this as an author and a creator?
I see, speaking for myself, I can say that my experience of this book, the best thing that can happen for me as an author is if people read the book. I don't personally care if you got it from the library, if you downloaded it off the internet. I mean, if you read it, I just tell people you read it, and I'm grateful. Like I see the benefits of readership and what grows from that readership. I'm not engaged in the corporate level discussions of licensing and IP, and I don't, I can say that I'm not constrained by saying that I just want you to read my book any way you can. Like, that's the best thing you can do. And I do wish there were more, there were more points of access between publishers and libraries and pubs and but I can see where these are very closed institutions, and it is evolving, and these conversations are happening in the rooms of writers and editors and publishers, but what the changes are slow because a lot of things are slow. But and so anyways, that's how I feel.
I think I'd like to take some questions, and I'm going to look at my phone because they're being texted to me. One question is exploration dead? Are we narrowing our horizons because we're being fed content not by librarians, but from corporations that use the data to just feed us things they think we're already interested in? This kind of filter bubble.
If I may make a book recommendation, that's not Joanne's book, but is equally amazing as Joanne's book, is Sophia Noble's what is it called? Algorithms of Oppression. It is a wonderful book that I think helps sort of contextualize, particularly from a library science point of view. She's a professor of information and library science. Sort of what's going on with the ways in which Google is controlling Google search and sort of corporate search is controlling information and embedding bias into the distribution of information. And also sort of in some ways, how many of you go to the second, third, fourth page of search results, right? You're very often constrained by what's at the very top.
Yeah, some of my art practice is about this question of exploration and filters and that sort of thing too. It's why one of the main things that I like to do is take, for example, random pages from books at Smithsonian books on the Internet Archive and tweet them out. It's just a way to add a little bit of serendipity and exploration into the information that you're being hit with, and I find that overly stringent like recommendation algorithms are usually wrong. They're usually not recommending what's actually good for me or helpful to me. So I also want to just point out that like these people talk about these algorithms as though like, oh, they're so correct that it's scary, but actually these algorithms are usually really just, I mean, they're just as fallible as anything else, and they're not as useful as we like to make them out to be. And when we fearmonger about them, I like to fearmonger about them being really wrong, as opposed to being so right that it's scary.
Here's a question for both of you. We've worked hard to move away from librarians as gatekeepers. And so it's a challenge to then level that with librarians becoming community moderators or facilitators. Not to say that libraries are any worse place than a large marketized corporation, but also there's a lot of fallibility within the library profession.
Yeah,
the mission.
I think that really what it comes down to is that accountability chain, though. you are always going to have a chain of accountability with a library that is more accessible to you than it, like the United States government has a hard time holding Facebook and Google accountable because they are multinational corporations, right? So like you as an individual person are probably not going to have a very easy time of that. And so for me, it's like, yes, these are both fallible institutions, but ultimately you can knock on someone's door and make a stink at your local library.
Here's someone who says, I'm an Internet Archive evangelist at my library. I'm trying to push them to get us digitizing our local history collection and adding it to the Internet Archive. And when you do that, it would be offered in a process called controlled digital lending. Jenny, can you speak tell us a little bit what that means and what libraries are doing?
Yeah, so controlled digital lending is a really powerful tool that libraries can use to digitize collections using fair use and what's called the right of first sale, which means when you own something, you can lend it in an own to loan ratio. So I think Nick might put a really good video, it's 2 minutes, that the Internet Archive produced about what controlled digital lending does and how it works. Libraries can partner with Open Library to make their collections available via the Internet Archive. That's great. It really encourages pride of place is one thing that's really, really important about controlled digital lending. And it also provides access to materials that haven't been seen before. Digitization has been empirically shown to improve obviously improve access to collections, but also improve use of collections and improve engagement with collections. And so controlled digital lending is really, really powerful. It's used by academic libraries, it's used by public libraries, and it's something that Library Futures encourages.
Now, we're at this really interesting time when the vast majority of people assume that Google has it, it's available. If they Google it, they'll get the best information. But we know at the Internet Archive that there's some really amazing information that has never made it online, that it will take the libraries of this world to go into their collections and digitize to preserve them. I noticed a comment by Brewster Kahle, the founder of Internet Archive, that libraries burn over time. Sadly, we saw that happen in Cape Town just last week, where some of the rarest and most precious African studies collections were lost in that fire. So should libraries have the right to own and digitize and lend in this new era, this new digital era? That is, I think, what Jenny is getting at. Licensing versus owning, the right to digitize and lend. Those are some of the frontline battles that I think we're seeing. I want to also acknowledge some of the comments from librarians who are quite frustrated with you, Darius, because they say that, libraries are underfunded. And who's going to put the paper in the printer? And we're understaffed, and our jobs are continually getting more and more precarious. So it is frustrating to hear this huge vision of what libraries should and could do.
Yes, and I tried to address this in the chat, but I also understand that not a lot of people can see the chat either, or might be looking at a recording. I'm trying to provide a framework where we can think about what is possible for libraries to do if libraries had more people and more resources and more funding and all of that stuff. I understand that libraries are working on a shoestring and making miracles happen based on being terribly underfunded. What I think, if we can't talk about how libraries can be better and more useful for their communities than something like Google, then it becomes very easy for a city council, for example, or a county board to just say, well, people have Google, we can shut down this library service or that library service.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk a little bit about the last chapter of your book too, where you talk about accountability. And we've been talking about how to make social media more library-like and moderated by libraries, but you have a different tact. You're saying that maybe we can make the internet more library-like. What did you mean by that?
Well, again, like I really, one of my regrets with that, with how I expressed it, is I never meant to say, let's throw more work on librarians who are already doing enough, and still it doesn't feel like enough. I mean, I make a contrast between the way that Amazon grew with the nature of libraries, you know, starting with books, and Amazon begins with books, and now they want to send rockets into space. Like, this is from point A to point B of this corporation. But even a library that has books and cake pans is just showing the expansiveness and generosity that is, meanwhile, not appreciated. The budgets are not necessarily there. But it goes to show like what a book actually is, and how it is the experience of sharing or buying books does kind of conjure up some other kind of imagination, or what sparks what comes next. So I wanted to, with that final section, I wanted to express like different ways of thinking about this information, very human information, and that in a book, we know that a human being wrote this book and they spent some time on it, and that sense of cherishing that book. Maybe we should cherish this material on Reddit, on Yahoo Answers. Yes, let me, not even the ones that are really like heralded as places for good information. LiveJournal, certainly. I mean, but maybe we should kind of figure out ways to preserve it, the value for what it is to those humans that shared it and what it was in that moment. And this is absolutely an ongoing process. Absolutely, we don't have Google's money, but we can do things that Google can't still to this day.
Oh no, I don't know if
Did we lose Wendy?
frozen.
Oh, no, I think did we lose Wendy?
Oh no. Well, I'll just, if it's okay if I just respond. I really wanted to uplift something that Robert Cardellano said in the chat, which is, let's not pit one essential service in our communities against the other. Libraries are an essential service, just like other civil services that serve community residents. And I think that's really right on. And so one thing that I hear a lot in design communities and in tech communities is like human scale is human scale design. And so that's one of the things that I think both of you have spoken really compellingly to. So I'm wondering if you want to maybe in our last couple of minutes address this question of how can we work as technologists and as designers and as writers and as people coming from a variety of backgrounds, how can we work together to think of libraries not necessarily as the sum of their collections, actively digitizing materials for researchers, providing Wi-Fi. We've seen this incredible uptick in libraries doing these parking lot Wi-Fi programs, bookmobiles. The pandemic has really brought out a lot of the community resilience, as well as showing these fissures and these structures. And so I'm wondering, how do you see technologists and libraries, and not libraries necessarily as this sort of figurative imaginary, but really, like, how would you see this working on the ground?
I mean, for me, it's I'm not an expert on this right now, and I'm pre-pandemic. I got to attend. I was lucky enough to attend a library conference full of librarians who were thinking about the future and were, just teaching me so much about their context. I think we need more communication between these different groups. There's only so much that I can do. As the chat rightly pointed out, there's only so much that I can do just, pontificating about what libraries need or what they can do. I do my best to talk to actual librarians, and I would like to do that more and learn more. But in the meantime, what I would say to technologists out there who might be in a similar position to me is to do your best to. I like to think about just like clawing the future into the present in little tiny pieces. And so I would say, use your imagination, build things, and try to use your imagination outside of just this context of like, oh, everything has to scale, everything has to, like, try to be more human centered, basically, in public thinking.
Yeah, what I would add to what Darius just said is that we are in the early stages of this conversation. These companies are still new. The ways that we engage with the internet is still, it's still a new process. So embracing that the potential is there. It's not going to be easy. And there are many, as this wide-ranging conversation has shown, there are many angles to this discussion, including like the ownership of materials, the sense of overworked librarians and community functions, and all of this together with the internet itself, which appears to be this like very glittery alternative to dealing with the messy reality offline. And these are challenges that we're just beginning to explore and brainstorm around. So I actually think this moment is extremely promising.
I want to thank you all, and thank you, Jenny, for jumping in when I got kicked out of Zoom. So many thoughtful comments, and one that resonates for me is people have said that it doesn't have to be about scale. It can be about human space and service as we move forward into exploring how people get access to the things they need. So thank you so much, Jenny, Joanne, and Darius. I want to remind people to please go to the Booksmith and buy a copy of Lurking. And you still have a chance to get yours. It can be autographed if you're among the first 50 to do so. And please stay afterwards. And we'll be having a more intimate time to chat with Joanne, with book holders. Furthermore, if you are interested in the battle to provide access to knowledge in this digital age, we ask you to visit empoweringlibraries.org and use the hashtag #empoweringlibraries. Follow us in social media at Internet Archive as we work with libraries and with patrons to bring you more and more access to knowledge. And finally, this new organization that's really doing such great work, libraryfutures.net. Go and visit them, learn more about their work, follow them on all of the social media. So thank you so much to all of you for being a part of this vital conversation. If you would like to, and you are a book purchaser, please stay on as everyone heads off into their day, and we'll spend just some time with Joanne, asking her questions as much as you would if we were together at the Internet Archive and she was signing your book. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.